that way we sync up.
Sure, I understand.
So, thank you for doing this. And
It's my pleasure.
Okay. So, keeping in mind that this film's being made for an uninitiated American audience, could you briefly explain what the National Party is?
The National Party is a political party that represents the centre-right. We're sister parties with the Republican Party, although not at all the same in nature. More, I think, to the centre and slightly to the right in terms of fiscal management, but socially more liberal than the Republican Party in the US. And both parties, main parties in New Zealand, are more to the centre than to the extremes.
Okay. And that's a good point. How would you compare conservatism generally in the United States compared to conservatism here?
People generally in New Zealand don't use the phrase conservatism. It's a phrase that historically has been important to the party. We conserve that which is important, but express it in a contemporary way. And modern politics in New Zealand has undertaken or overseen that evolution of concepts which root us in our history, but take us forward in terms of just dealing with the reality of today.
Okay. Could I bring you back to the 1980s? Was there a lot of skepticism in the political process in the 1980s during the era of Rogernomics?
The skepticism grew amongst the public when New Zealand had to grow up. We had been the food basket of Europe, nurtured by the United Kingdom, and had a very favoured status. When the UK joined the European Union, New Zealand got kicked out of bed and suddenly became a teenager heading for adulthood. What happened then was the need for massive reform, economic reform, social reform, a review of a lot of the fundamental premises that our welfare state and our economic framework had been based on. And as change, which came almost as a shock in the early to mid-80s through to the early to mid-90s, certainly some scepticism emerged. Not so much in the electoral system as in why does politics and change make us feel less secure?
And it was the National Party that first put out the referendum to change to the MMP system. What were National's goals in putting the referendum out there?
Look, there had been an emerging debate in New Zealand, and it wasn't only about electoral law. New Zealand has always had a very fair electoral law frame in terms of allowing any citizen to stand. You don't have to be deeply wealthy. Indeed, we constrain people who are wealthy from overspending so that the race is even and accessible. But the diversity of the New Zealand population lay at the heart of the debate around mixed member proportionality. People asked the question, is 45 or 47% of the vote in a first past the post setting a genuine representation of the multiple interests in this multicultural society? And it was that lay at the heart. That and perhaps other issues as well. The Green Movement was emerging, Maori Renaissance was going on, and there were these new emerging voices, and it was in that context that an electoral system came under debate. The National Party said, we think we should open this debate up and see whether New Zealand is still wishing to have a first past the post system or another system. So there was one vote to test status quo or change, and then when the public said, look, we quite like the idea of change, there was a second vote on a range of options where the New Zealand public were allowed to explore what the elements of those options were, and that's where mixed member proportionality emerged.
Actually, wasn't it David Lange at the debate who said that there would be a referendum, but the Labour Party just didn't follow through on that?
Well, I would say that's par for the course. You know, politics is filled with people who have big ideas and good intentions. History's littered with those folk. This was an issue. It was in our time, and the former Prime Minister James Bolger was the person who, I think, quite properly put it on the agenda, even though we didn't necessarily agree. You know, sometimes a big idea's time has come, and you have no choice but to explore firstly as a party and then in the public arena whether this is the right time. And it was the right time to test that question.
Well, I mean, it must have shaken up a lot of people who had established electorate seats. It went from, I believe, 99 Was it 90 or 99?
There had been 99 seats, and we went to 60 constituency seats and 60 list seats. But actually it wasn't as big a jolt as people anticipated, because many people made adjustments and the party accommodated people in that transition. I think what was more of a shock was that a number of individuals and interest groups realised that they needed to give birth to some new parties in order to participate. And it created a degree of surprise, some degree of excitement and curiosity. And for the people who were used to a two-party system, a degree of alarm. It was that change rather than the individuals who, I think, accepted the change. It was the change in the party structure that caught the attention.
When you're talking about people breaking off and forming their own parties, are you talking about Winston Peters?
Not necessarily about individuals. I think the public's response, even though they had voted for change, suddenly as change came through and we needed then individuals to lead parties, I actually think that Winston and Peter Dunn and others managed that transition very well. So did the Green Party, and subsequently so has the Maori Party. It's been a very orderly and natural evolution. I think the public found it more confusing as it did emerge. You know, what do these people stand for? Is the tail wagging the dog? All of those types of questions, not the creation of the parties themselves, but the reorientation of how people work together was the thing that really created surprise.
So, let me just check this. How much influence do you think that third parties have in MMP? Would you say it's disproportionate or proportionate?
I think there have been mixed experiences in New Zealand's 10-year history so far. Generally speaking, I think that it's been managed well. I think in the public's mind, sometimes there's a feeling that it's a disproportionate, but increasingly leaders of the majority party have worked out ways in which to accommodate the minority in order to get their support, but also keep an orderly government process. That actually emerged very quickly. While there was a hiccup or a disruption in the first year or 18 months of the first coalition, despite a lot of predictions, in fact, minor parties worked out that they wished to stay in government, negotiations were undertaken, and people accommodated each other. And in my experience, what was publicly described as a volatile coalition that I led, in fact, on a day-to-day basis, was an extremely orderly coalition. What it does do is change the way the dialogue has to occur. And it does require people to set objectives as a whole, and usually the main party has the prerogative of doing that. But if you want support, you have to accommodate priorities of the other parties. And that's become New Zealand's pattern.
You mentioned your coalition with New Zealand First. Why did that form? Why did that coalition form, and why did it eventually break apart?
You should put the question of the formation to both Jim Bolger and Win Peters. While I was involved in that negotiation, and it was an intensely interesting process because it was our first, and it took time to work our way through, many weeks actually. I think it was formed because there was an agreement, a very clearly defined coalition agreement about both what we would do and how we would work together. And it lay a good basis for the first part of the coalition. For a range of reasons, both the leadership of my own party changed, which I think altered the landscape slightly, and then there was a controversial issue which had not been foreshadowed in the coalition agreement, which Winston, for his own reasons, decided to leave the cabinet. And that led in the end, after a negotiation, there was a mechanism in the coalition agreement that if there was a dispute, that's how the dispute was tested. And in the end, it led to the breakdown of that coalition agreement. But history now records that a proportion of Winston's party broke away, and they made it clear they wished to retain their relationship in the coalition. And the ACT party at that time, plus I think 2 independents, also indicated they wished to be part of the government, and we had a very stable, albeit relatively new type of coalition until the election in 1999. And Helen Clark subsequently has been able to move from one grouping to another in order to win support. Effectively, from the time that Winston left office as Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer, we have had minority governments with agreements as opposed to a coalition. The coalition was the first year and a bit, and subsequently I led a minority government, and our current Prime Minister Helen Clark has led minority governments with a variety of agreements on confidence and supply.
You were there during the first negotiations. What was the emotional impact that went through your head when you realized that you were doing something brand new for the first time that had never been done in New Zealand's democracy?
Look, you just get on and do those things. By then, the choices had been clearly made. The public expressed their voice both at the referendi and at the election, and it was then the duty of the politicians who were in the senior groups to make it work. And all I recall is a sense of duty and a very diligent and systematic approach on each side. We had been in governments, and so as the coalition ideas were being tested, ministers would go away and officials would cost ideas and give advice and so on, and in the end we were able to put an agreement together. So did others, and in the end Winston, for his own reasons, decided to come with the National Party.
Let's see. Do you believe that the two major parties, perhaps you can speak more for National than for Labour, but have they become more broad spectrum parties or narrower parties under MMP, or has there been little change?
I think they're definitely broader. You know, the New Zealand public's an interesting group of people. They seriously view both concepts of equality and representation as a right and an entitlement, and any party with any brains wouldn't dream of putting up candidates that represented a narrow view. I mean, in my own party today we have Maori people, Pacific Island people, Asian members of parliament, men, women, and if you don't choose your candidates carefully, both in the constituencies and in the list, you shouldn't expect support. So I think during that period, quite apart from the mixed member proportional system, there was an awakening in the New Zealand public that they wanted a broader view represented in the Parliament. And MMP certainly allows parties to facilitate that. You have your electorate seats, and then once those people are secured, you then look at the list, and if there's not a balance of gender or ethnicity or otherwise, you've got an ability to correct that. And certainly my experience within the political party, the National Party, the party members are very acutely aware of the need for our party to be representative of the public, but also capable of serving the broad interests of the public. And so it's led to a very healthy diversification of the types of people who are in New Zealand politics.
Could you, are we still good?
Thank you.
Okay. Back when MMP was an issue, when it was debated on, what were some of the arguments against MMP, and did those predictions bear out?
I think the two major arguments were would the country in dire circumstances be able to be led decisively? And the second one was, would the tyranny of the minority become a feature as opposed to the tyranny of the majority, which was the pre-MMP accusation or statement. Did either of them come true? I don't know, it's probably almost too soon to say. I think that my single experience that answers the first question, I was Prime Minister during the Asian economic crisis, and I had this complicated minority government that I was working with and leading. And interestingly, I made clear to them, look, we're in trouble as a country. The region is in difficulty, and we have to pare back our spending. And if we don't, then we're either not useful stewards for our country and we're simply digging a hole. every single one of the minority party and independents were willing to participate in what was quite a difficult budget round and so on. So I think the assertion that when difficult things need to be done, you can't persuade coalition minorities or minority party partners is, at least in that instance, was not true. We haven't had another economic crisis or major event since then, although the current Prime Minister sometimes has not been able to win support from one group, and she's then had to go and try to work with other minorities. And in general, I think she also has been able to demonstrate that challenging issues like security and so on, if you put the case, you can find support within parliaments. The tyranny of the minority, we've had glimpses of that, but I seriously don't think it's a feature that you could claim was real. There are some lobby groups who have a particular view who would argue that that's been the case, that their view has not been able to have such a predominant focus, but many would argue that's not a bad thing. There are a greater multiplicity of voices heard in the body politic than ever before, and that's a healthy and vibrant democracy that it leads to.
Why was there a non-binding referendum before holding the binding one?
I think that we were feeling our way. I actually don't recall us paying that much attention to it. It wasn't a big deal. I think some of the lobbyists probably felt it was a big deal, but I don't think there was anything malicious amongst politicians at the time. It was look, let's see how many people participate, what they say, and so on. And particularly the issues of the level of participation in a referendum. Prior to agreeing, for example, it would be binding. If a very small proportion of people had voted, then being bound is not a democratic position. I recall the arguments being more general, than specific, but definitely once we were heading for a choice, then we were committing to be bound by that.
Were you personally surprised by the results of the 1992 non-binding referendum, where I believe it was over 75% for MMP?
The answer is no, I wasn't, but they were massive times of change at that time. I mean, I had been welfare minister and we had been making massive changes to the welfare state, which were really at the front edge of what have now become worldwide trends of welfare reform. But it was controversial at the time. And I think to some extent that early vote was a be damned on all your houses, both the previous Labour Party, who had also been very much of a reform mode, and there'd been the share market collapse in 97. So a lot of things had unsettled voters. And then when we came in and found that the Labour Party had left a complete and utter fiscal pickle, plus some really serious demands, we had no choice but to look at some very big issues, a bank on its knees and so on. And we took a series of very decisive measures under Prime Minister Bulger's leadership. And the public were pretty unsettled in 1992.
Just
11 minutes, Brian.
What?
We've got 11 minutes.
Okay. Just looking for the right questions, because I want to get the more important ones, not waste your time. You mentioned that there were a number of lobbyists that were unsettled by this. Could you explain a little bit about that, about the opposition to MMP?
Well, look, I think it's a matter of what you don't know. Even some of us in Parliament, in fact, both myself and the current Prime Minister, initially were not in support of change. Having said that, both of us, I think, probably facilitated and led change highly effectively in the periods in which we were in office. Because as a marginally capable set of politicians, you do what you do. You're leaders of ideas, you're leaders of implementation, and when the public speaks in a democratic setting, you get on and do it. I do think that there had been lobby groups historically who had the comfortable ear of governments, and often they were quite conservative groups. The church, some of the established iwi amongst Maori, some of the business lobby groups. It wasn't exclusively business or culture, it was a series of the establishment in a series of different settings. And actually under MMP, a whole lot of new voices popped up, younger business people. Urban Maori said, well, hey, hang on a minute, there are more of us than in the... So it was an invitation to allow people to think, I've got a place to stand here and perhaps I'll shuffle my way through. So it's been a very interesting period over the last decade, watching people who would otherwise not have participated becoming much more active.
And let's see. When people vote in MMP, are they voting for the people in the party on the list and in their electorate, or are they voting for the policies of the party? In other words, is it more the personalities or the idea?
I don't think there's a clean answer to that question. And one of the weaknesses of MMP is it leaves you with a device where literally each individual voter makes that choice. Some of them, it will be completely and utterly the emphasis of the direction of the party and what it's offering the country that would lead to the party vote allocation. In constituencies, in my experience, it's much more about the personality. I mean, I know that people who may not have voted for National would vote for me because for a range of reasons they felt I served my constituency well or otherwise. So I think the constituency, while it was still partly bound by party allegiances, it tended to pull more, or at least in part, on the individual. The party issue also had to show a balanced list, and I think it was a range of things that the public weighed up as they voted. I don't think it was the people on the list or the policies or individuals in the constituency. If anything, it's become more diffused than that, and people tend to think, is this the right direction? Is this the wrong direction? Are these capable people? Are they not capable people? Is this scandal-ridden? Is it kosher? Are we sick of these folk? And New Zealand has a pattern of giving one party a chance and then giving another party a chance. And I think all of these things lie behind what people are thinking.
Actually, since you mentioned that, the Labour Party spent 9 years in power from 1949 to 1993 under first past the post. That's around 20% of the elections, 3 out of 15. And since the adoption of MMP, there's been 4 elections, and Labour has been in power after 3 of those 4 elections. And that's a pretty steep change. And is it that the people are shifting more to the left in the past decade, or has MMP made a difference to the way people, has coalitions caused people to be able to vote for more left parties, for more coalitions?
I think it's too soon to say.
Too soon?
I think cyclically we may well be in for a change, and you can't tell. I think that there is still a residual first past the post mentality amongst some of the parliamentarians. The dominant party still behaves to some extent like an FPP party. But most of the parties in the middle of New Zealand politics say publicly that they would be at least persuaded in part by the party that gets the majority of the vote. And I think it's too soon to say. Clearly in the last 2 elections, the Labour Party has got the majority of the vote, and other minor parties have then been prepared to coalesce. I think if that alters, if a national party gets the majority of the vote, whether that test is then born to be true, I think will answer your question. It's premature to say that because we haven't been in that situation. My pick is this will finish up being a balance as it's always been.
And let's see. How has campaigning and electioneering, how has that changed under MMP?
Not at all.
Not at all?
It's still very much a leader-focused campaign, and the big party, it's quite presidential in the big parties. The minority parties scurry around trying to get their voices heard and usually are frustrated, at least in part. But the television programs tend to proportionately allocate time based on a form of voting pattern. But no, it hasn't materially altered the way in which electioneering occurs.
Let's see.
What has changed is that people feel they can pick and choose. I mean, some of them will say, oh, well, I'm going to give the National Party my vote, but I like the Green member, and I actually like them being there, and because they're in my seat, I'll vote for them. It's more a menu of choices than the old behaviour. And I certainly think the old allegiances that people had of I'm a National Party person or I'm a Labour Party person very much have altered. A lot of people in the centre-right might give one vote to the National Party and one to ACT, depending on where they live. And that's a very much more predominant feature, splitting votes, than historically was the case.
I think that's, the last question. Do you believe that mixed member proportional has made politicians more accountable to the public?
Not at all.
No.
I think the accountability is borne out by the diversification of voices in the Parliament. In my experience, members of Parliament have always been accountable. You can get hired and fired in politics by people voting you in and out, certainly in electorates. And I've always preferred that. I wanted to be accountable to my constituency, and if they were sick of me, down the road. Equally, parties, the majority can become a minority very quickly. And again, the voice of the public in New Zealand is something that, in my experience, even the major parties completely and utterly respect. I mean, I would defend democracy before I would demand the right to remain a leader on every minute of every day, because the vibrance that a democratic process that's well balanced gives a nation is so much better than the alternative. And while of course it's personally disappointing, you shouldn't be in it if you don't understand the game. And perhaps lastly, just on MMP, while I was, like others, not necessarily pro-change, I don't think there will be a change back. And I do think a mixed member proportional system allows New Zealand to stand as it is today, looking at a future quite differently, where our minority groups and our minority interests sit alongside majority interests and majority views. And in the end, that proper dialogue which modern society must rely on can occur. And while it does have its stumbles and it does have its hiccups, I do think it's a very useful model, particularly when there's a broad range of parties and particularly where you've got multicultural societies. I think it is serving New Zealand very well today.
Helen, did you have any questions?
I do have one question. I'll ask you to directly answer to Brian, just for the camera's sake. Do you think that the single transferable vote system has any advantages or disadvantages over MMP?
I think that people didn't understand the alternatives at the time, but I don't think New Zealand will go back. I would be very surprised personally if there is a review of the type of mixed member system. I may be reading it wrongly, but my sense is that we're stuck with this. And there are merits of each. Transferable votes are useful in some circumstances. Mixed member, I think, allows a greater proportion of people to come through to reflect diversity because the lists are so large. And on balance, I think it's here to stay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for doing this.
That's fine. Good luck with it.
Thank you. And we'll be out of here in about 10 minutes and after
That's
we pack
fine.
everything up.
The staff will look after you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
We'll keep in touch via email at the
Thanks.
time of distribution.
That's fine.
How we go.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for your time. Great.
Good timing.